still read Dawkins and still think there's a watchmaker. You know, how crazy is this? And you know, I used to
hook, line, and sinker. You accepted it.
I never fully had faith in any of those things. So there was always this: as long as I got an open mind, I'm superior. As long as I don't have faith in anything. Like I would always, it would have these. It's funny because I could never see the hypocrisy or the change in my position. But in some points of debate or discussions, I would be like, "We know this. This is true. Look at all the evidence."
Categorical.
And then, you know, when cornered, it'd be like, "Maybe not. Maybe not." And for me, I just did not see the hypocrisy in that.
And were you evangelizing atheism? Would you say?
Oh, very much. This was part of the. I was in when school. I'd always be taking on, particularly Christians, as mostly surrounded by Christians. I went to a church school before I went to secular school, I also had some Jewish friends to talk to them about this stuff as well. But I was vehemently anti-religious. Anyone who was religious, I wanted to sort of save them, or at least get them out of the face of other people and stop them spreading the diseases and stuff.
And at that time, if I said to you, you're going to be in Speaker's Corner 20 years from now talking about God, you'd say you're insane, right? It was unthinkable. Unthinkable that you're going to
Yeah, I mean, I would have probably said I never say never.
Right.
But, I would have said that I strongly doubt you're ever going to come up with any kind of evidence or proof that's sufficient because of the very nature of the thing you're claiming. I would say you're claiming something metaphysical, and we have better methods of achieving, access to truth than that. So I was very convinced that I would never be predicting such proof. But I always said,
Did you accept metaphysics though? Did you accept that there's things beyond science, assumptions about the world being real, assumptions about epistemology and these types of things?
Ironically, for me, those were all the gaps.
Gaps, okay.
Yeah, so the whole God of the gaps thing, I mean, that's projection. Because all those metaphysical things actually represented gaps. And so either we knew what it was, because we had some canonical orthodoxy, we had some institutions had agreed this was the right theory or whatever, or it was one of the gaps. And so you can analyse and entertain those things metaphysically if it helps you deal with things, or helps you, patch between two different areas. You can talk about consciousness and metaphysical entity if you want, but ultimately underlying it there'd be some physical reality that we've maybe yet to have a proper authenticated canonical theory.
So were you a physicalist?
Yes, yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay. And did you believe that physicalism was a proposition or a conclusion? Did you believe that, okay, this is my faith, I'm a physicalist, it's a proposition which I cannot prove, or it is just simply truth?
No, for me, it was a combination of brute facts and something which had been proved.
A brute fact and?
For me, it was a brute fact, but also something that could be proved. Because I didn't realise at the time my philosophical maturity wasn't quite there enough to realise that if you're claiming something's a proved fact, you shouldn't really be claiming it can be proved. But I was like, you could take either.
That's an interesting...
Because previously I was like, well look, you can either just obviously everything physical, and if you want to build this hierarchy of abstract things, you can, and at some point you go beyond what you physically know, you go for it, but it's all mental gymnastics to me. Like if you need to, go for it. So you could do that way, or I could say, well look, we can prove it from first principles. Let's start with empirical observations. Everything comes from knowledge, comes from your eyes and ears.
So you believed in a form of scientism of some sort?
Yes, but also a baby is born with just a ton of connections in its brain, and it just blurts out whatever, and then the connections very quickly die off, and it gives shape to its its brain and its ability to then make sense of the world. And so. Yeah, what we term knowledge, really, recognition of structure and patterns.
So, when you were in this particular position and you're coming to these realizations, like you said previously, that there's all these parameters which I thought were immovable and unquestionable, but actually they're just assumptions. So things about physics itself, things about reality itself. I think you referred to Bohr earlier.
That was Born, Max Born.
Max Born, yes.
Different from Bohr.
Yeah. And that barrier being in place, firstly you have to be aware of the barrier, and then challenging that barrier meant the door to metaphysics was far more open than you initially supposed. Would that be the right way of putting it?
Yeah, it was interesting because the guy I was talking to, Kareem, mashallah, he had so much patience with me. I was attacking him for like 6 months straight, and there was this gradual realization, and that really, if I'm fair, if you apply the same standards, then I was relying on metaphysical entities during my studies, because at the time I would sort of fell into this Platonic belief, for example, which is pretty much how you're taught to think of physics, really, that made equations metaphysical entities, or rather the things equations represent being metaphysical entities, or that nature. Because at some point, however you go back, this is because of this, because of this, because of this, either it goes around in circles, in which case you're in the world of circular logic, or it doesn't go around in circles and it at some point terminates. And that's where I realized, if I have multiple points of termination, then Occam's razor is against me.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
So would you say at that point you became a sort of foundationalist? Things have to go back to self-evident truths which cannot be proven.
I always had a problem with self-evident truths because of human limitations. So using that as a basis for things, I always had a problem with it.
So what was your foundation at that point that led you to believing in God? What was the springboard or the catalyst?
The springboard was really, it was realizing certain necessary aspects of atheist belief.
Certain necessary aspects of atheist belief, I mean faith-based aspects.
Well, as I discussed before, although you can ideologically paint these atheist belief systems or structures, and there were different ones, sort of flavors I tried. I used to be, like I said, when I approached Kareem, I was very much a hard atheist, and I became a soft atheist at some point because the hard atheist position became untenable. Sorry, what's the question?
What was the catalyst that took you from that hard naturalism, physicalism, to, okay, before we get to God, the door to God is open. Not God itself, but, okay, there's something maybe beyond physicalism.
It was really leveling the playing field, because the thing with privateers versus pirates, freedom fighters versus terrorists. So privateers were, British state-sponsored pirates.
Oh, I see.
And pirates were,
so it's a subjective label we give.
It's where you give them the label, and that sort of gains the playing field to start with.
Sure.
And so I realised, really, if we spoke about things on a level playing field as being entities with certain properties and characteristics, then, my prejudged argument saying, oh, it's a God, sort of fell away. And then I realised, well, I also have entities with various different characteristics, and, I could come up with some de jure reasons why, this is different from that, without realising it was part of European exceptionalism. But de facto, trying to establish my beliefs without having a de facto God, one on was untenable.
So would you say
that was really sort of the thing, and I realised at some point.
Would you say in a way that you discovered teleology is inescapable? Some form of telos, some form of purpose, agency, some form of personality, right? Some form of non-physicalistic consciousness was there.
The only problem I have with adopting the word consciousness is its definition is woolly, even today. We don't have a good definition of consciousness. So I break it down into sort of what I regard to be more fundamental aspects. So, for example, something that is able to convey information, I would choose. So information is a well-defined thing. I can talk about information theory, or we can talk about information in physical systems. We can talk about the possessor or originator of power, and the thing that exerts will, intention. So we could talk about these aspects, but I wouldn't sort of bundle things up in consciousness. Like every, I guess I said before I'm autistic, every single term has to be very, very well defined.
Okay, so let's start with non-reductive materialism. Was that would that capture your position?
Define non-reductive materialism as you see it.
That's a good question. So materialism, everything can be broken down to physical causes, effects within time, space, and matter.
Yes.
You were? Okay, good.
I was previously, yeah.
Okay, so that position changing over to a new position. What was the new position?
There wasn't really a well-founded intermediate position between that and La ilaha illallah. Because it was, as I sort of tried to find my new position, because I couldn't bear hypocrisy, but I was sure there'd be some other kind of way, and just trying to search for and find these positions, I realised that ultimately it wouldn't. And so I ended up being, okay, whatever the nature of this one God is, there is one of them. Okay. And it's super, so there's, I think, if memory serves, the order was there must be one such entity, and then there was that entity must be external to and encompassing the thing that it made. And then then the things about knowledge and will came later after that. So it was kind of looking at the Isma wa Sifat.
Wow.
But I can't remember the exact order. I wish I could, but I'm pretty certain that okay, if there is something other than things that are built from physicality, there must be one of them. If there were more than one of them, that introduces its own system of contradictions. So it was, I'd say that was the first bit.
Yeah. So Allah says in the Quran, if there was more than one, the heavens and the earth they would be in disarray. So conceptually,
it was very interesting when I read that, because it's such a deep statement, and I have seen many videos where people sort of talk about this, and people go, yeah, I guess, like they would have a clash of interests and whatever, but I know it's way more fundamental than that. I mean, you end up with axiomatic systems, effectively, that are incongruent with one another, and therefore you end up with this kind of, you're going to end up with a beyond chaotic system. It would be a system that would never be able to
cohere,
settle, never be able to cohere, but also would never really be able to come into what we could define as a cogent, consistent existence.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things that was a very interesting realization as well, is that reality is all connected, it's all consistently connected. And it's funny how, like, when you learn about quantum theory, maybe a bit in A levels, you think, okay, there's you've got your protons and neutrons in the middle, and you've got electrons on the outside, and free space in between. 99% free space in that. And you learn that there's gravity, two separate masses, like really between them. And by the time you go through and you're in the third year doing masters, or you're doing further research, and you look at the nature of quantum fields and what they really are, you have to have what's called, there's this topic called topology, which is the study of the structure and connectivity thing. And things have to be, topologically connected, and that's a fundamental requirement. Like, without that, you can't even build these equations, and you can't even, build physical theories.
So, if I was to ask you, like, because you were an atheist, a militant atheist that became a Muslim, there's an argument I use, and I want you to check. You study theoretical physics, whether this is something that coheres. So when I have an atheist that come up to me and they say, don't worry about causality because quantum mechanics has challenged that, or randomness exists, I usually give an answer, and I want your honest thoughts on this. I could be right or wrong, but I want your thoughts. What I say to them is this: quantum mechanics currently cannot be used as an argument against causality or something else, because one, there isn't a consensus. We have the many worlds, we have the Copenhagen, we have the informational, relational, shut up and calculate. So to try and make an argument when there's no consensus, that itself doesn't make any sense. Secondly, the interpretations of those things have presumptions, and those presumptions are not laid out to the public. So to come up with these ideas like quantum mechanics challenges predestination, it's premature. That's the argument I make.
It is premature usually. I think one thing you've got to note is that quantum mechanics as properly defined is only defined mathematically. It only has a mathematical definition which is a correct representation of it. As soon as you start using cultural language, it's a misrepresentation. It's like
interesting.
If you take the names and attributes of Allah and you just translate them into the nearest English alternative, you don't get a correct representation. And this is why we see people straw manning it all the time, right? And so it's a similar thing. You'll find these people who are saying, quantum mechanics challenges causality, I bet most of them will just have read popular science articles, or they've watched some video or whatever and found it interesting, and they sort of pounced on this as being something. So to go back to what you're saying, like all these different interpretations of quantum mechanics basically don't make any difference to functional use of quantum mechanics, which is really an engineering tool.
Could I put it in other words? Yeah. What you're saying is, because quantum mechanics is only put in mathematical language, when you use another term and try and import that, you're going to lose what the data or the argument is. So for example, causality...
You lose what has actually been validated. So what has been validated is the mathematical model, not the interpretations.
Good.
Right. This is very, very important. Good. And yet people take the interpretations as being somehow validated, or at least plausible, because they are in some way consistent with mathematics. But here's the trick. They're not. We're still looking for an interpretation that is consistent with the mathematics. There's always a problem. And that's sort of where we are. That's why we're in this position of big mystery.
And would you say, sometimes we're told science makes a lot of progress, but it seems in this domain of quantum mechanics, there hasn't been much progress in 100 years.
This is very interesting, because there is a big difference between what's spoken about inside and outside of the institutions. And Sabine Hossenfelder is one of those who's sort of breaking those silos again. But I look at, for example, Sean Carroll. There's so many times when I've seen his public lectures and he says, we know this, we know that, and yet then he's got funding to work on papers to look at the very thing that's unknown that he said we know. Because, so there is a lot of, I don't think it's intentional dishonesty. There's this kind of system of saying, oh well, when we're preaching to the masses, we're allowed to dumb down, simplify, whatever. It doesn't matter how wrong it is, as long as they feel they've got something.
Yeah. So what do you think about Sabine? What do you think about her claims that she makes about big science, misrepresentation, funding? She's made some very surprising claims, let's put it that way.
I think she's very honest, and a lot of the claims that she said, they match up with what I suspected or have seen or have heard anyway, and I don't think they're that crazy. It's a lot more honest perspective of how science works. It's, at the end of the day, physics and the other sciences, really, they are sociological phenomena. And that was a bitter pill to swallow, because I used to, without realising, I put my faith in it. Now, that doesn't make it fundamentally right or wrong, but you've got to realise that throughout the development of physical theories, we take from Newton onwards, or you take from pre-Newton, it's always been a few competing theories. There's never as many theories as there are people's brains. It's not like everyone gets their own theory. There's this flocking that goes on, and then there becomes like a duel between them, and then there's the winner. Like in thermodynamics, there was caloric theory versus the other nature of temperature and what it meant, and so on. So there's the battle, and then one wins. And then there was quaternions versus Cartesians, and that was related to the constructive versus formalist wars I was talking about, and one of them wins. And then there's, the views of electromagnetism, and then one of them wins. Is there an ether? And so on.
Philosophers call this the underdetermination of theory by observation. As in, there's a huge problem that the same data can give rise to alternative theories which are completely inconsistent.
Well, this is one of the interesting things, because the proof is usually, it only needs to be sufficient to defeat the other contenders.
Yes.
Right? But it's only which other contenders are permitted. And that you can't have too many contenders. And it's not like, it's difficult to talk about this stuff properly because, sorry, I have to look closer because, basically, I didn't say that, but, it's difficult to talk about this without sounding like you're saying scientists are all involved in some big active
we have to be careful of that.
Because there is, I believe what's happening is more like an emergent collusion. So it's like an emergent phenomenon. If you take the sort of rules of the system, how it works, you get a bunch of people who have to vie for a certain amount of funding. There is a certain kind of structure, and therefore there's some kind of hierarchy. Some people have tenure. There's a limited amount of lab resources, so on and so forth. Like all of these factors conspire, and also there was this dramatic shift in sort of, publishing and the expectation to push out papers, and how publish or perish. The importance of having papers.
And one paper having 15 authors.
Well, yeah, this too. But the other one is an interesting shift where, people accept this idea of, to be scientific it has to be falsifiable. It's like, yes, that's true, but it also, that doesn't take away the requirement of verifiability. You need both. So then you had a whole bunch of people associated with CERN, for example, that are just throwing out some theory, saying, it's get falsified, that's still valid science. And it's like, but it was never going to work. The maths never worked. You never even showed. I think a lot of people appeared to start using experiments as an alternative to doing the maths, because the maths got too hard. Right? There's this whole. A lot of people don't realise you've got to look at the timing of things, right? You had Richard Feynman, who was credited with the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. And this, at the time, was insane, because you have what's called a divergent infinite series, and you're summing it up. So if anybody other than Feynman had suggested that, they would have been laughed out of academia. If a student had suggested it, they'd be laughed out of the classroom, and told to go study, because summing a convergent series is like, it's just demonstrating you don't understand the basics. But he gets to just say it, people just flock and find a way to make it work. This is kind of fascinating, but in the course of doing that, they then use various different bits of data where they say, okay, I can find these statistical correlations and connections and so on and so forth, and I can make these fit. In the beginning, this math wasn't reproducible. It originally developed, calculated the structure constant and then recalculated it and make it fit and so on.
And I would say also that there's a lot of name dropping used. I mean, the argument from authority is not invalid. Like, sometimes you can say, for example, I'll refer to Michael Roos and I'll say Michael Roos said this, right? But in the case where there are arguments from authority, but the argument from that authority, the people don't even understand.
It's interesting. So I take the position, I used to take a very hard position that argument from authority is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
Now I take the position that argument from authority can, it can help you to spend your time more wisely.
Yeah.
Right? So that's good, but you can't affect you in matters of faith. I would not change.
Even in Islam we have this. We have schools of thought, Hanafi and Shafi.
But I would never believe something just because a scholar says so. But I also wouldn't waste my time going through like every random person's opinion and treat them as more important or interesting than Ibn Taymiyyah. But also just because it's come from Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't mean okay, I accept it because he's not Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? But so it gets a bit complicated. Similarly with with physics, you have people like it keeps popping up on my YouTube. There's this guy called Unzicker. This guy called Unzicker, I think it is.
Right.
He also has a lot of challenges to modern physics, but he also has no authority and no credibility. But I spent some time looking into him anyway. But he also doesn't seem to have any real comprehension of how physics works. So he doesn't have, so he has no authority, but he also has not credentials. But apart from the credentials, if you give him the time and space, you find out he's just straw manning things left, right, and centre, and doesn't really get it in the first place.
There's a lot.
So it depends what kind of basis of authority you're speaking about. Right? Authority through credentialism or through institution versus authority through lots of people follow them. Right? There's Professor Dave explains on the
I just debated him.
how he's allowed to call himself a professor when he just has a bachelor's degree. I have no idea. You see what I mean? But having 4 million followers makes people treat him as a sort of authority.
So just on that point, when I debated him a few days ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. It's on my YouTube channel. So I asked him about somatic hypermutation. He didn't know what that was. I asked him about genetic assimilation. He didn't know what that was.
He doesn't even understand emergence. He doesn't understand chaos.
I'll tell you something really funny, right?
Have you seen him against Dr. Jim Tour?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a child. Jim's a proper,
chemist
he's really good.
Look, I'll tell you something really funny during the debate. I gave him the 4 distinctions of causality of Aristotle to explain. Dennis Noble refers to them because he's trying to explain that genes are not efficient causes, they're causes in terms of form or templates or databases. He just wouldn't get it, and I thought, this is such a basic point. So, you're right, there's a lot of these pretenders online And I'll take your number. I'll send you the debate as well for you to watch.
I mean, I don't want to talk about someone who's not present too much. I only mention them in terms of differentiating different types of authority.
Yeah.
And so that's really sort of where I was getting at. So,
and that's they're people.
For me, you know, that you take the different supposed authorities in different ways or for different reasons. But still, for me, like the only genuine authority is Allah, whatever dependent on comes from Allah, and that's very important to me. And that's part of
your ultimate.
That's part of the reason that Islam was so strong in the first place, is because going back to what I said before, probably before the cameras aside or not, but it's essentially you cannot do any better than the single axiom system. And so that's what it comes down to. And so as long as everything is rooted from that axiom, that's the source of the authority. Now, if someone comes along and says, "I'm telling you something," and it fits neatly in this tree and below without contradicting anything else, it's like, okay, cool. I can take that on temporarily. Many people say it fits in more, it sits well in my heart, it works when I speak to other people and so on. Gradually it becomes more part of it. But everything in this tree is potentially sacrificial except the Shahada. This is the fundamental action.
You know what I love about what you said? It reminds me very clearly of that statement of the Quran in which Allah says, whose statement is truer than Allah? As in, you need one foundation, one base, one branch, one root, one center where you're like, okay, that's immovable. Now let me build my worldview.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting about this is because I used to think, religious people use God as gaps, they use God as an alternative to thinking and understanding and so on. And so, for me, I thought they used it as an alternative to reason and so on. But then, actually, I used to have different kind of rationalities broken into different philosophical areas. Biology over here, maths over here, physics over here, and so on. And the fact that no one can glue them together in a consistent fashion, never mind. It's just how things are. One of the axioms that accept knowledge is fundamentally in separable compartments. And that was the construction of the Enlightenment. And so when you have the single axiom approach, everything was unified. There's no barrier to investigating those things, quite the contrary. Now there was no issue in looking at how they were related. All of a sudden, I was actually quite able to mentally connect, chaos theory and emergence that we were studying in nonlinear dynamics with, information theory, with the concept of where did the information come from in the universe, given the second order thermodynamics and so on. So that was a very important point, was how the concept of God actually enables better and deeper investigation of various scientific areas and their connectivity,
and it's not,
rather than what I thought would be the opposite.
It's not just the hard sciences, it goes into the social sciences. It goes into human nature, human behavior, ethics, morals. One of the things that atheists say is theists are using God of the gaps. So they're using gaps, and they're using gaps to try and show there must be a God, right? When we say God is not an explanation of the gaps, God is the explanation of reality itself.
You know what's interesting is I looked for this God of the gaps argument. The God of the gaps argument is in almost every case.
Sorry, say that again?
The God of the gaps argument is in almost every case projected from someone else onto believers. It's not actually a position most believers hold themselves. Very few people say, there's all these gaps in knowledge, so I'm going to plug them with God. No one says that in reality. That's not, and